Linguistic diversity in East Asian publishing may challenge catalogers, especially those of us working with materials that arrive from China but are written in what are officially called minority languages, such as Tibetan, Mongolian, and Uyghur. There are long-established conventions for cataloging these languages. In 2015, for example, the Library of Congress approved a revision to the Tibetan romanization table, first drafted more than 50 years ago, so that it now reflects the most prevalent romanization schema used by Tibetan studies scholars internationally, the Wiley Tibetan system. The South Asian Cooperative Acquisitions Program of the Library of Congress, seated in Delhi, India, has been distributing Tibetan language materials to university libraries in North America since the 1960s. As of 2013, 14 institutions were subscribed to the SACAP program. Full-level bibliographic records accompany all of the books, periodicals, and AV materials received, and most schools simply copy catalog these materials. More recently initiated or revived collections are highlighted here. Columbia University holds about 15,000 volumes of Tibetan language print materials alone. We also purchase many titles outside of the LC program through acquisition trips and via firm orders from China-based vendors, such that our backlog is now about 3,000 volumes. In recent years, leading vendors in China began creating OCLC bibliographic records for minority language publications. As Tibetan Studies Librarian, I'm responsible for both acquisition and cataloging, so I'm generally happy to discover these vendor records while working in WorldCat. They alert me to titles that we may not yet own. However, the metadata in these vendor records is recorded solely in Chinese. While here, Tib is recorded in the language fixed field, more typically, CHI for Chinese is recorded in the fixed field, and the words Zhangwen, meaning Tibetan in Chinese, are written parenthetically in the 245 field. These Chinese language records make it very difficult and sometimes impossible to determine whether we have already purchased the book under its Tibetan title, especially if we own an earlier edition with another ISBN. But that aside, I don't complain if these records are encoded as preliminary records, that is, with encoding level M. What is more problematic is that at least 2 vendors, and even a few university libraries, have started encoding the Chinese-only records as full level, that is, with an I in the fixed field. While this may be permissible for Chinese language cataloging standards, I do not know. It is not permissible by LC or RDA standards. It is as if a book, written solely in Chinese, were described all in French with absolutely no reference to the original language. The record you just saw, for example, is for this book, a monastic history written entirely in Tibetan. The Chinese title was drawn from the title page verso. I began noticing these so-called full-level records a few years ago, and they have become even more numerous. My colleagues who catalog Mongolian materials confirmed that they too frequently find Chinese-only records for their materials, often encoded as full-level. For this reason, I want to bring this issue to the attention of the SEAL community and remind original and copy catalogers that these are preliminary records and should be identified accordingly. So, what to do about this? For those of us creating original bibliographic records in Tibetan language, in North America this is primarily the Library of Congress and Columbia University, we need to bravely replace these ENG records, whether encoded M or I. Otherwise, we will find duplicate and triplicate records in WorldCat. It is already happening and starting to create a mess. In this screen, an ISBN search led to 3 results. Considering that total WorldCat records for a Tibetan book rarely exceeds 13, the situation is a bit ridiculous and surely inconvenient or even confusing for users. Here we can see there are 13 holdings on the Tibetan record. This was inevitably, it must be a Library of Congress record, but we still have the existing Chinese vendor record, which is effectively a duplicate. For the remainder of the presentation, I would like to give practical instruction for both bibliographic and authority records. By following certain practices, we can collectively reduce the number of duplicate records in WorldCat and provide the most accurate metadata for our users. First, how can you identify a good record? You may be tempted to copy catalog using the Chinese record since you recognize the title, but please keep in mind that the Tibetan language records are those that abide by LC standards. With supervision from our Technical Services Director, I do update or recatalog existing ENG records in the language of the piece. When LC uploads its records, typically after the vendor records are not being replaced since hardly any of the fields match, aside from the ISBN. Now, as I encounter these duplicate, sometimes triplicate records, I've been reporting them to OCLC. Please be aware if your local systems are automatically updated, then you may start finding the Tibetan language records in your institution's catalog. Here is my revised record for the earlier monastic history. By convention, we catalogers of these materials have been adding the Chinese title, which appears either in CIP data or on the title page verso or in the Chinese colophon, in a 246 field with first indicator 1 and a mention of the title source in subfield I. While RDA prescribes that a parallel title, wherever it appears, should be recorded in subfield B of the 245, this would apply to almost every single Tibetan book published in China, even when items are entirely in Tibetan. In our OPACs, the result is confusing for readers because it appears to them that the book is bilingual. That said, if the Chinese title appears on the title page or on the cover, and certainly if the book is bilingual, then we do record the Chinese title in the 245, either in subfield A or B, depending on the situation. Here we return back to our original example, Shizang Banjiao Fota. And my point here is to make a third point. Please do not create authority records in Chinese for books written in Tibetan language. It is quite probable that the author has already been established under his or her Tibetan name. So in this record, for example, we can see that the editor's name is Yongdan Pangso, and a 700 field was added for this name and an authority record created. However, if assistance had been sought, the cataloger would have discovered that there's already an authority record for this editor under his Tibetan name. Of course, best practice here, we should add the Chinese variant spelling or Chinese version of his name in a 400 field. These last few slides are to illustrate my fourth point. There are an increasing number of Chinese studies on Tibetan subjects and translations of minority language material. I have seen several examples of Chinese language records that make no reference to the original work, nor do they use the correct classification with the translation cutter. The inability then to co-locate the books is also a disservice for our readers. In this case, the author that is mentioned in the 100 field actually did have an authority record. He is a religious teacher, and the authority record was created in Tibetan quite some time ago. Here's an example of a record where the Chinese version of the name has been added in the 400, which is, of course, helpful for searching purposes and for us catalogers. Although there is no formal funnel project, we do have a Tibetan Resources Working Group, and we'd be very happy to search or review any personal, corporate, or family names to be sure there is no existing authority record. The TRWG can also point to resources to support the work of seal catalogers to identify the original text, author, subject, etc. of such works that reference lesser-known language material. TRWG could also put your institutions in touch with a project cataloger, for example, and we are eager to cooperate for the purpose of maintaining the authority file as best we can. In closing, I would ask please for your help to raise with our vendors the issue of Chinese-only cataloging, which does not fully account for linguistic diversity. The vast bulk of Tibetan publications are issued from the PRC. It would serve the world community if the National Library of China or another institution could contribute to our efforts to catalog these diverse materials in accord with high-quality international standards.